Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. Today we will move forward a bit with the history of modern Jerusalem to a very fascinating and interesting period, the period in which the city for the first time is under Jewish sovereignty since, I would say, the Second Temple period, and etc. And we'll talk about the first, I would say, section of the Israeli city from 1948 till the end of the 80s, meaning 40 years, of which we can divide or relate to two sub-periods, two wars. In fact, the first period is the period of the divided city, and I will explain a bit further, and after 67, the united contested city of Jerusalem. And in our next lecture, next week, we'll discuss of what I call post-Oslo Jerusalem, how the city has developed and changed from the 1990s and until today. So, let's get to 1948, of which the year where we ended our last session. On the 30th of November 1948, a ceasefire has concluded the war after almost around a year of fighting between Jews and Palestinians in the city, a war which began as a civil war between the parties and in May 1948 developed into an regional war in which Arab states also interfered, the Jordanian army, Egyptian army, and etc. And at the end of this war, we have a new geography, a new geopolitics in the city. The city is divided between two states, Jordan on the eastern side and Israel on the western side. And you can see it in the map, the green line that has divided the city coming from the north, going all the way to the south, leaving the old city and almost all the holy sites in the Jordanian side, and then at the south turning to the west. And in fact, Jerusalem, Israeli Jerusalem, was now encircled from three sides, the south, the east, and the north, by a foreign enemy country. Now that means that the city has transformed from being a regional center during the British period, in which it's the seat of the British government, the seat of the British army in the Middle East, the center of the region of what we call now the West Bank, with villages, Jewish and Arab villages around it, to a divided cities, of which in the Israeli side, at least, it's what we called in Israel, a city in Hebrew, the city at the end of a corridor. It's very hard for a city to develop from such a position. If we're talking about the demography of the city, we have to relate to a total spatial demography change. In the West Jerusalem, for example, at the southern side of the West Jerusalem, before the war, we had around 25,000 Muslims and Christian communities living at the south of Jerusalem in the neighborhoods of Baka, Talbiya, and Katamon. During the fights, most of those residents have fled outside of the city, some to East Jerusalem, some to other countries. That was the elite of the Palestinian society in the city, and a third of the total Arab population of the city now moved to the other side. On the eastern side, we had some small Jewish communities, not many, around 5,000, most of them living in the Jewish quarter in the old city, also fleeing during the battles to West Jerusalem. So now we have a total separation between, almost total separation between around 100,000 Jews on the west side and 60,000 Arab Palestinians on the east side. The only case in which we still had Arabs in west side was the village of Beit Safafa that was divided between Jordan and Israel. So a new geography, a total change, but not only that. Here we see the border, that's another image of the border that crossed the city and really shaped the everyday reality. we have now neighborhoods on the Israeli side that are sitting near the border. Most of them used to be Arab neighborhoods before, like Mamila, Musrara, and etc. But some of them were Jewish, like Yamin Moshe, which became dangerous neighborhoods. People did not want to live near the border. It was a hot border. Occasionally, Jordanian soldiers used to shoot across the border, but the Israeli government and the municipality wanted people to live there. And that relates to another demographic change that happened in the city. In the Israeli city, during the battles, 20,000 of the Jewish population has left the city, moving mostly to Tel Aviv and the area. That was the elite of the Jewish population. So the city shrank from 100,000 Jewish population before the war to 80,000. But from 48, even during the war, till 50, additional amount of 15,000 Jews, mostly immigrants, came to the city, and those immigrants, most of them coming from Muslim countries, have been sent to resettle the neighborhoods on the border. Here we see an image of the no man's land that divided. In some parts of the border, there was a gap between the Israeli and the Jordanian border, especially near the old city, and this gap was a no man's land. Mostly the army put mines in it so you couldn't enter, but again, the heart of the city, the historical heart of the city, the old city itself could not be accessed from the Israeli side. This is another image of a street, Emil Bota Street. Maybe some of you know it. It's just near the King David Hotel. Street that ends up with a fence and a border cut in the middle, just near the most important touristic hotel in the city, the most luxurious one. So the border was always there, existing in the everyday life of the city. Now, we discussed issues of urban planning a lot during this crash course, and now I have to relate to a very important master plan. The first Israeli master plan that were made by the government for Jerusalem in 1949 already. It's called the Rau Plan, by the name of the planner Heinz Rau, that designed it. And he had to reinvent Jerusalem, in fact. Now, think about this new reality. Jerusalem, West Jerusalem, the Israeli Jerusalem, is now a city without its historic and spiritual heart, in a sense. The city was always developing from the old city onwards. And now, what kind of a soul does this new city has? It has to reinvent its own landscape. And in many ways, the Rau Plan is like a mirror image to the sites and locations that were lost to the Jordanian side. So for example, if the Holy Basin was on the Jordanian side, we create a new Holy Basin, which is the governmental compound that you see here at the center of Jerusalem, where today you can find the Knesset and the governmental offices and even the new campus of the University Givat Ram. You have to reinvent new holy sites for pilgrimage for Jerusalem. So instead of the Temple Mountain, we have now the Herzl Mountain. You see the green area over here, of which the bones of Herzl were brought from Europe and put there, and also you had a Yad Vashem museum built there, and etc. So, and what you can see from what I described, that it's not only a new, I would say, sacred geography, but it's a new geography which is based on secularism and nationality, what we call mamlachti. And in fact, for the leaders of the country, Ben Gurion and Mapai and etc., which were socialist, which mostly were secular, it was actually an opportunity to reinvent Jerusalem. For them, in many ways, they had an ambivalent, I would say, attitude towards the religious weight of the city. And now they can create a new centrale in Jerusalem, which is more identical, more related to the new nature of the state. This is where the Rau plan comes. And also what you can see in the plan is how the city moving westward. In the light brown areas, these are the neighborhoods. In green, these are parks. A clear kind of modernist, I would say, strategy of urban planning with a clear division between commercial area, the city center, residential area, and park area, what we call zoning. Now we will talk a bit, and I will say in advance that I will relate a bit to the Jordanian city a bit forward, but we will focus on the Israeli city here. One of the most important decisions during this period is the decision to declare Jerusalem as the capital of Jerusalem. Now, you think to yourself, probably, of course, they would declare Jerusalem, but that wasn't such a matter-of-fact thing. There actually was a discussion during 48 and 49 in the government of Israel, which most of the ministers, the clerks, and etc. were living in Tel Aviv. They were part of the Chalutzi, I would say, Zionism that preferred the new Hebrew city. And for them, it wasn't a matter of fact that they should rebuild the governmental offices in Jerusalem, but eventually Ben-Gurion has decided to move forward, especially in front of a plan of the UN to declare Jerusalem as an international space divided from the Jordanian state and the Israeli state. So kind of a contrary action to this decision, they decided they would declare Jerusalem as the capital city, and then they forced, in a way, most of the governmental offices with all the workers to move to Jerusalem to their families. And this decision has created a lot of changes in the demography of the city, because even until that point, most of the population in West Jerusalem were either religious, ultra-Orthodox, or Mizrahi Jews that came to the city throughout the years, not the mass immigration of Mizrahi Jews, but I would say the majority population of the state at that point, the Ashkenazi secular elite, were not present in Jerusalem. But with this move of the governmental offices, with the clerks and the officials and all the workers and their families, there was a new nuclear, I would say, community that grew up through the years, becoming in the 70s and the 80s the majority of the population of the city. That also defined, this transition defined the economy of Jerusalem for the following years based on public sector work and leaving again the business development, the industrial centers to other cities, mostly Tel Aviv and Haifa as the industrial center, leaving Jerusalem as the public sector city, the university, small businesses mostly, but again creating this growing gap, economic gap between Jerusalem and the other metropolitan centers. And of course, there was a sort of hierarchy, I would say a social hierarchy within the new geography of West Jerusalem. As I said earlier, around 15,000 immigrants came during the war and a bit after the war to Jerusalem to fill the gap of the people who flee from the city. But where would they live? This huge amount of people, and later on, a few more thousand, tens of thousands came also during the 50s. So the first stage, the immigrants were sent to what we call the evacuated Palestinian properties, or there were many Arab Palestinian neighborhoods left deserted in West Jerusalem, and the properties, the houses themselves became by the law the property of the government. And the government now leased those properties to the new immigrants and also other Israelis now that moved to Jerusalem for many reasons. But if you took, for example, this is the neighborhood of Musara, which you see, a villa in which one wealthy Palestinian family lived in kind of very good conditions, now were split to 4 or 5 Mizrahi families, and most of those neighborhoods were close to the border, were unsafe, and their physical conditions, they were very, very bad. In fact, during the 50s and the 60s, the border neighborhoods of Jerusalem, like Mamila or Musrara, became a national symbol of the neglect and the terrible condition in which the Mizrahi population lived in Israel as a whole, becoming the seat of a future movement, the Israeli Black Panthers, that evolved in the neighborhood of Musrara, for example. Later on, when all those houses were filled, now they had to build what we call the transit camps, ma'abarot. Ma'abarot were built in South Jerusalem. I will show you a picture a bit forward. Those were temporary residential, again, horrible conditions. In the snow, in the rain, it was almost unbearable to live there. Only in later on, in the 50s, middle 50s, they started to build the working class neighborhoods of Kiryat Yovel, Katamonim, on the margins of the city, but a bit better than the condition that they had before. So, for example, this is a picture from 1950 in Mamila. Some of you might know the Mamila shopping mall. This is how it looked like. There was an old Arab, Christian, Muslim neighborhood, a mixed neighborhood. Here at the background, we see Notre Dame. Maybe some of you can relate. And this is the condition where they lived. They had no running water in those neighborhoods. It was half ruined, a dangerous place, really close to the border. This is the site of the transit camp, the Ma'abara in Talpiot. Later on was developed in the 60s as the Talpiot industrial area. So before the industrial area, that was this camp. Houses built of metal, of steel, very hot in the summer, bad conditions, but a very quick and cheap solution to house people. Many of them, refugees themselves coming from North Africa and other Muslim countries. And this is the site, an image of Kiryat Yovel. Some of you probably know the name, and you see the transition from the transit camp to the neighborhood itself, a working class neighborhood at the west side of Jerusalem. And here is another picture of Kiryat Yovel. So you can clearly see that the materials were really quick. It was there is almost no, I would say, development of anything else besides the housing, right? No greenery, no roads almost, a bit infrastructure that were added later throughout the years. Not a very pleasant place to stay, but some of the people growing up there, that became part of their legacy, you know. We went through the Ma'abarot, through the hard conditions, but some of them are still keeping the scars because there were other neighborhoods in the city. This is, for example, Rasko, Shimoni Street. That was a neighborhood built for the governmental officials that moved with the government to Israel, close to Givat Ram. Here you already see that still, you know, the housing project, but in a higher quality, more designed, a bit more aesthetical aspects, and etc. And the elite of Jerusalem lived closer to the city center in what we call sectorial compounds. For example, this is a house that were built for veterans, Haganah veterans in Talbieh. And other projects like that were built, for example, Shikun HaSofrim and HaItonaim, the poets and writers and etc. They build their own compound and etc. And here you could already see that they use the Jerusalem stone, a more expensive and more aesthetic material. And of course, the elite came to the best neighborhood of Jerusalem, either Rehavia or in that case Talbieh, a former Arab-Palestinian neighborhood, which now became the neighborhood of the judges and the professors of the Hebrew University. So we can see how this transition has shifted the city from a mixed city to now a divided city, and within the divided city, a new hierarchy between the elite mostly secular Ashkenazi, not only secular, also modern Orthodox, and now at the bottom of the hierarchy on the western side, the Mizrahi immigrants and maybe ultra-Orthodox as well. And this is a good time to mention that the beginning of what we call the Haredi, ultra-Orthodox enclave in Jerusalem, can also be related to this period. Now, Haredi population in Jerusalem was living, of course, in the city even before Zionism during the 19th century. They were the majority of the city. They were called the Old Yeshuv at that point. Still, always consistent, a very important part of the city, but concentrated in the north parts of West Jerusalem, Mea Shearim, and the area, and etc. Up to 1948, most of this population has seen itself as even anti-Zionist. But the more the people, the more secular or Nor Haredi Jewish people came to the city, especially from the 50s on, you see more and more struggles around issues of public space, who will live in the neighborhoods, and etc. And Haredi families being larger with more kids and etc., around 7, then it was a bit more, 5 or 6 for each family. They grew rapidly, and the territory grows rapidly. And as you can see, this is an image from the early 80s, actually. Now, this is the area of the Haredi, ultra-Orthodox population in the city. This is the old city for some of you. So the original enclave was around here. You can see my cursor here. And then you see this growth during the 70s, 80s in the north. Today I can tell you that all the upper part, almost all the upper part of this map is ultra-Orthodox. So this expansion, territorial expansion, continues on until today, and every time creates those conflicts and struggles about issues of Shabbat, residential rights, and etc. A very important part of the politics, I would say, of the city until today. And in our next lecture, I will relate a bit more about those relations and what they mean today. If I'm going back to the Rao plan, just to show you some of this geography which I just described. So here on the west side, we see Kiryat Yovel, the working class neighborhoods. On the south, also Katamonim. This is where the working class Jerusalemite lived. And more to the center, the upper elite, Rechavia, Talbia area. This is the Beit HaKerem, and the Haredi population were living in the north. So and during the 50s, 60s in the north, you would still see secular population, Mizrahi population. Some of the neighborhoods, like Makor Baruch, for example, were still mixed and etc. But this is already changing during the 50s and 4th. I related to the new sacred geographies. So here is the image of the governmental compound, Kiryat HaMemshala, in the center of Jerusalem, with these modernist new structures of the Knesset and the governmental offices, and a new holy site, the Herzl grave, which I mentioned. If you would come to Jerusalem during the 50s as a guest of the government, or even as a tourist, you would always go to the Herzl grave. And even more so, the youth movements, הנוער העובד, מחנות העולים, הצופים, every year there was a pilgrimage of 4 days going up to Jerusalem from the Shfela, from the Beit Shemesh area, and first visiting the Herzl grave. And it's amazing how in 20 years the religious geography has been altered in that way, creating a new secular places. And of course, the Hebrew University continued to play a very important role in the development of the city. I think I mentioned it in earlier classes. The Hebrew University was established in 1925, and the first campus was in Mount Scopus. Now, Mount Scopus was left under Israeli sovereignty, but as an enclave across the border in the east of Jerusalem, in the eastern side of Jerusalem. So de facto, you couldn't have campus life there. Also, according to the agreements, you can only go up to the mountain once in 2 weeks. It was a dangerous place. They had to find a new campus to the university, which was, of course, a very difficult situation to be in. Very abruptly, in 1948, the campus, the university, found itself without classes, without laboratories, without a place to teach. And the first period of this transition, during the 50s, was actually very interesting, in which the university located itself in the city center in different 50 buildings. The center of it was actually Christian institutions that now hosted the university, like Terra Santa High School, which is a Catholic British, have a British school, but a Catholic establishment that now became the humanities faculty. Another monastery, Ratisbom, became the faculty of law, and etc. Why it was those Christian institutions, that's also interesting, because those institutions now were left in West Jerusalem without their believers, which were mostly Arab Palestinian Christians that were not living in this part of the building. So they were sitting there empty, in many cases bankrupt, because no donation, no movement. So there was kind of a new win-win situation between the university and those institutions. They were looking for a space, and the monasteries hosted them. So it was an interesting partnership for a decade. But already during the 50s, near the governmental compound, they located a new grounds for a new campus, bringing the top of the architects at that time to create I would say, the institutional architecture of the new state, which you see in the building, this modernist, clean, functional houses, right? All of them, they try to represent the new, modest, maybe socialist, I would say, values of the country. Nothing, that opens your eyes too much, not luxurious, but very functional, and it was identical to many of the institutional building, I would say, also in Europe, in England and West Europe during that area. At the end, actually, of the campus, you see the new building then, the new building of the National Library, which just recently has moved to a new building outside the campus. Now I want to dedicate a few minutes to discuss the politics of the municipality during this area, which were also very interesting. I called it shifting from a crisis area to a more stable area. The first generation of Israeli mayors were actually, what was interesting about them, that they were not affiliated with the governing party in Israel, the Mapai. They were actually coming from the opposition or from the center. For example, Daniel Oster, which you see on the left, he was a centralist from the General Zionist, that was the party. Something that you can relate to Yesh Atid today, right? A more bourgeois, upper middle class, pro-liberal economically, and etc. Daniel Oster was the vice mayor during the British area, and it was natural to nominate him as the succeeding mayor during the war. And he managed to keep the seat until 1951. But in 51 until 53, it is actually the Mafdal, the National Religious Party, then called Hapoel Mizrahi, that their representatives has been ruling the municipality, coming straight from I wouldn't say the opposition of Mapai, but certainly not the same type of people governing other major cities in the country. They didn't manage, all of them didn't manage to rule the city, but not not all of them was their responsibility. The city was in ruins after the war. The physical infrastructure was ruined from bombing. They had to repair the water, electricity. They had huge waves of new immigrants, mostly poor immigrants, without jobs, dislocated now, that moved into the city. The elite of the city, I would say, mostly the business elite, left them. This is not a very easy condition to govern this kind of a city with the border and all those problems, and the government which always interferes and doesn't give them an easy end. Right? The government were not at ease with the fact that other parties are controlling the capital of the city, and they were a bit, tight with budgets and helps and etc. But also on the other side, those people did not have the capabilities to control this ship. In 1958, the city is bankrupt, and the government nominates a committee that rules the city for half a year until the election. And then in 1955, for the first time, a Mapai representative, Gershon Aguron, is coming into the seat as the head of the municipality, as the mayor, starting a period that will continue almost 50 years, in which the mayor is related, if not directly, indirectly, to what we call the central left parties, mostly Mapai, Avoda, and later on, which enabled those mayors, in a sense, I would say, to approach easier for demands for budgets, for influencing different ministers, and etc., but also gave the opening signal for what I call the secularization of Jerusalem. Few words about them. Gershon Aguron was the editor-chief of the Palestine Post during the British era, now became Jerusalem Post. Some of you probably know this paper, and he was an English speaker, and maybe the first, I would say, public figure that came into the seat during the Israeli period. He was succeeded by Mordechai Ish Shalom, which was more a kind of functionaire, we call it in Israel, a party operative, not a very glamorous figure, but very, I would say, effective. And later on, we started a very long period from 1965 to 1993 with Teddy Kollek, which I would say a few words now. What we call today Teddy's Jerusalem. Who was Teddy Kollek? Maybe the person that influenced more than anyone else the landscape of the city, its economy, its society during the 70s, 80s, and until today, when you walk in West Jerusalem, in many places, you walk on what Teddy built in Jerusalem. This is why they also called him Herod, even, the Herod of Jerusalem. Teddy Kollek was the manager of, before he came to the city in Jerusalem, he was the manager-chief of the prime minister office during the 50s. He was Ben-Gurion's guy, many ways, the bulldozer, the person that made things happen in this important governmental office. One of his major projects, personal projects during this period, was the establishment of the Israeli Museum. So even before he was a mayor, he already advanced a very important institution in the city, the Israeli Museum, and he had this vision that he were living in the city. He was born in Vienna, and he felt that Jerusalem is, too much marginal, a city in the Middle East. He had this kind of a notion, I want to transform Jerusalem, to westernize it, maybe, to bring high culture to Jerusalem. He wanted Jerusalem to be known, I would say, in one sentence, to be mentioned in one sentence with places like London, Paris, and New York, at least culture-wise. And he started with the Israeli Museum. It helped him win the election in 1965 because the Jerusalemites knew him. and continued on during the 70s, and I relate a bit further on about what happened in the city in 67, but in the 70s he's establishing a series of cultural institutions, very important ones, the Jerusalem Theater, Mishkenot Sha'ananim, the Jerusalem Cinematheque, the Han Theater, the Karon Theater, etc., and all of them concentrated along 1 mile from the old city into West Jerusalem. It was called the Cultural Mile, and also hosting events, national and international events like the film festival, which you see in the picture, the International Jerusalem Film Festival, or the Israel Festival that was now conducted in the Israel Theater. And each time he brought his friends, the Hollywood actors he knew personally, Frank Sinatra, Kirk Douglas, Danny Kaye, and etc. He had a lot of personal connections, mostly in the States, which he used to also bring those people to kind of spread their stardust in his city, lift the image, the cultural image of the city, but also to bring donations to the city. He was the biggest schnorrer in Israel. He was known like that. He was a genius in fundraising, and many of those new institutions didn't came from public funds. Jerusalem didn't have enough money to build those institutions. It was almost all philanthropic donations from Jewish diaspora, mostly from the West, of course. And Teddy was very, very popular. I remember I grew up in the 80s in Jerusalem. I grew up in a right-wing family. And I'm saying that because for me it was interesting because Teddy was related to Mapai, to Avodah Party. And it was known that he is from the left. And I asked my parents, how come in Jerusalem, where the majority of the population is considered right-wing, and it was the same thing as today in the 80s, and even you, I asked my parents, you are right-wing, but still he gets voted time and time again and wins in landslide, in high numbers. And my father told me, in Jerusalem, he's a good mayor. We don't care about national politics. We just want the best mayor for Jerusalem, and he's the best one. And, imagine talking politics today in such a manner. We wish we've been in these days where the division, the binary between left and right weren't so stark as today. Okay, I will move forward and I will later talk a bit more about Teddy's Jerusalem and a few words about Jordanian Jerusalem. Again, in this 19 years between 48 and 67, what happened in the eastern side of the city, and I would say a different transition. If the western side of the city was struggling, but eventually demographically growing, for example, after the war, you had around 19,000 Jews living in West Jerusalem. At 1967, we're talking about 200,000. So the city more than doubled itself. On the Jordanian side, you have stagnation. You have around 50,000 after the war living on the Jordanian side. In 1967, we talk about 67,000. So a small increase, but mostly stagnation. And this stagnation happens because Jordan had its own capital, Amman. And even though Jerusalem was important, they were very proud to own Jerusalem. It gave them a lot of prestige in the Arab world, and etc. But they were afraid of the Palestinian population in the city, and they tried to keep it as a the city as in a minor position comparing to Amman. So, in fact, kind of disinvesting in it during the 50s. Abdallah, by the way, the first Abdallah, the king of Jordan, was assassinated in Jerusalem in 1951. And this was a very traumatic event. He was assassinated by a local Palestinian person. And it also shows, the friction between the Jordanian Hashemite rulers, which were considered by the Palestinians as a collaborators with the Zionists, with the Israel state, and the local Palestinian population. So on one hand, it's a Muslim, it's an Arab rule, it's not totally foreign as the British or as today Israeli Jews, but again, it's not a self-rule of Palestinians. It's a sort of Jordanian, I would say, kind of occupation. And you can see in this picture of the Jordanian Jerusalem, how small the Jordanian Jerusalem is, and it almost didn't develop during those years. Most of the people were living in the old city itself, including the deserted Jewish quarter, and in some small neighborhoods north to the old city, Azahara, Wadi Joz, Sheikh Jarrah, for example, which we see here. The whole size of the municipal boundaries of the Jordanian cities was 6 square kilometers. Very small, compared to 36 square kilometers on the western side. Only in the 60s, we see a kind of a change in approach towards the city. They realized the touristic potential of the city and the money, the taxes that they can collect from such an opportunity, and they start to invest more in the touristic infrastructure. I will show, this is the example for Jerusalem had an airport. It was built during the British area, but the Jordanians are renovating it, and in fact, you could, in the 50s, you can take a plane from Beirut, land in Jerusalem, go to Al-Aqsa, and go back at the same day, something you can do until today. This airport was still in function also under Israeli rule until the 90s, but never as a civic airport, mostly as a military airport. So this is a sign of kind of different attitudes during the 60s. And I'll just finish with this part of the Jordanian Jerusalem. Again, I'm sorry I can't relate too much to this side. We decided to focus on the Israeli city, but until today you can go to the neighborhood of Beit Hanina and see this grid, unfinished building construction of a palace that King Hussein, the king that succeeded Abdallah, built for himself at the north of Jerusalem in 1965. He didn't finish it, and it stays vacant until today because it's kind of, we relate to it as belonging to Jordan, but a great place for a viewpoint on North Jerusalem, I recommend. It's called the Tel El-Ful, the Palace of King Hussein. We have a few minutes left, not enough for the great following transition in the city geography. Of course, the 6 Days War, 1967, June, Jerusalem, Israel has its historical victory over the Arab armies, now occupying not only Sinai and Golan, but also East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Not like the other territories which I mentioned, East Jerusalem, few days after the war, 3 weeks after the war, is legally annexed by the Israeli state to the state of Israel. So while the West Bank is now and the Gaza Strip, and even the Golan at that point of time, but later on it was also annexed. But importantly, the West Bank Palestinians were now under military rule, but from 1967, East Jerusalem Palestinians are now direct civic Israeli rule, which created a new subgroup within the Palestinian population, East Jerusalemites. They didn't have the same rights as Palestinian citizens of Israel, but also not the same set of rights as West Bank Palestinians. That's something that we will focus on in our next session. And this is a map of the new boundaries. After the war, a team of generals, which is very interested, conveyed a month after the war to declare the new municipal boundaries of Jerusalem. In blue, you can see the older West Jerusalem, the 36 square kilometers. In green, you see an enlarged part of Jordanian Jerusalem, a bit more than the 6 square kilometers which I mentioned earlier. Some of that was added later on. And now the new municipal boundary is what we see in orange. The city, the Western Israeli city, added to itself 70 square kilometers. In fact, tripled its size, that is now under direct Israeli control. In red, actually, you see areas that were annexed to the city in the 90s. Today, Jerusalem, its territory is 126 square kilometers, and I mentioned this number because the city is larger than Paris, which is very interesting. Jerusalem area is very, very large in any kind of global international terms, but the density of the housing is very low. So in Paris, for example, we have around 105 square kilometers, but more than 2 million people living there. In Jerusalem, 126 square kilometers today, but only 1 million residents. So, and why did they choose to enlarge the boundaries so much, including now 28 Palestinian villages that were never part of Jerusalem, like Shoafat, Beit Hanina, Silwan, and etc. So Bacher in the south, and many other localities. They choose the boundaries, I told you it were generals, according to topographic locations, strategic topographic hills surrounding Jerusalem that were now kept under Israeli direct sovereignty to prevent a new invasion or any possibility of invading to the city and reoccupying it again, and etc. So the new boundaries are not deriving from an urban logic, but from a strategic military logic. A new plan followed, which is interesting, the 1968 Master Plan of Jerusalem, which tried to relate to this new condition. The plan, I would only say a few words, was trying to build a dense city. And what you see, a clear integration between West and East Jerusalem. They tried to, actually, the boundaries are large, but they said, let's concentrate the residential, the commercial areas in the center. We don't want the city to grow too much because then it's harder to control the areas. There would be a dislocation. We have to unite the city. You see also those kind of horizontal roads that were planned to cross from east to west Jerusalem. In both aims, the plan did not reach the aims, mostly because the governmental offices that de facto controlled the construction in Jerusalem did not pay attention to the plan. And now the planning of Jerusalem was, in a sense, governed by demographic political aims. And the example for that was the construction of around 12 new neighborhoods, Jewish neighborhoods, in the annexed territories of East Jerusalem. You see, like Ramot, Ramat Shlomo, Atarot, Neve Yaakov, Pisgat Ze'ev, Har Choma later on, and Gilo. Each neighborhood is like a small city. I grew up in Gilo, in the south. When I was a child, we had around almost 40,000 people living in Gilo, like a small city in Jerusalem. So there was this. Why did they construct those neighborhoods in East Jerusalem? Because of demographic political reasons. They wanted to create a new geography in East Jerusalem, to Judaize this area, to prevent the option of dividing the city again. Most of those neighborhoods were built on confiscated lands, appropriated lands from either Palestinian owners or something area that was a public domain in the Jordanian area, in between the Arab neighborhoods, creating this jigsaw in East Jerusalem of Jewish and Arab neighborhoods that are very close to each other, but almost totally divided. And if we come back to the idea that the logic was strategic, was military, the fact that you build a neighborhood like, let's say, Neve Yaakov, which is almost 10 kilometers away from the city center, created a very wide city with neighborhoods that were really remote, had a very weak connection to the city center, and these new neighborhoods has kind of waited on the city, weakening the city center for the decades in the future. This is an image of the French Hill, one of those neighborhoods. You see now, the country now can afford to build in a bit more style, not something glamorous, but you saw the projects in the 50s. These are the projects of the 70s. So they use the Jerusalem stone. You see the greenery, a bit more thinking about public space, about walking distances, and etc. But still, it's kind of those neighborhoods were built to host people, to attract Jews to East Jerusalem, to change the demography, to keep a Jewish majority in the city. I move forward because we don't have enough time, and this is actually the end, and I will just relate to the last thing. In 1980, the government approves the basic law, Jerusalem, capital of Israel, which in this law they declare that any future transfer of authority in those annexed territory, in the whole of Jerusalem, to any foreign body is illegal, and because it's a basic law, you need a special majority to change it, and they put this law against any peace plan in the future that will try to divide the city between Palestinians or etc. and any other idea. This is a major obstacle until today for kind of diplomatic solution in the city. Following the law, the few embassies that were still in Jerusalem after 1967, almost all of them left Jerusalem, and until today there is an ongoing effort of trying to bring back embassies, for example, the U.S. embassies and etc. But this law created this kind of change in the atmosphere around the Israeli control over East Jerusalem. I would say that Jerusalem, in those 2 decades, I will conclude with that, and I will add more in our next session, was actually quite thriving. East and West Jerusalem, during those 2 decades of Israeli control in East Jerusalem, it was an unequal political situation. There was discrimination against Arabs, but the borders of the city were open. You could move around, and people also felt safe enough to move between East and West Jerusalem back and forth. As I mentioned, you had these huge international festivals in the city. People were actually relating to Jerusalem as a sort of cultural capital, different from Tel Aviv, but had its own unique. We had the bohemian life, and many artists were living in Jerusalem, the professor, the TV people, the centrality of the Hebrew University back then were also keeping that. The majority in the 80s, the majority of the Jewish population is secular Jews. And that's something that rapidly changed during the 90s. But all of that kind of came to a halt and to maybe an end in 1997 with the eruption of the First Intifada. I will talk about it in our next meeting. Thank you, and now it's time for some questions.
Thank you very much, Marik. First of all, can you say something about numbers in Jerusalem? How many people live in Jerusalem today?
Today, okay, so today we have officially crossed the 1 million number, which is far the largest city in Israel. The next biggest city is Tel Aviv with 400,000, 450,000, so it's twice the size of Tel Aviv. Within this population, we have today 40% Palestinians and 60% Jews.
All right, you mentioned the Jews who left the city, left Jerusalem in 1948. What happened to their neighborhoods? Was they settled also by refugees, or did they return to them?
You mean the neighborhoods that were left by Jews in the eastern side of Jerusalem, if correctly? There are a few neighborhoods like Nahalat Shimon and some areas in Sheikh Jarrah, and of course the Jewish quarter. According to Israeli law, if you had a property prior to 48, if you are a Jew and had a property in East Jerusalem, you can return the rights to yourself and even evacuate families that are living currently in these properties. That caused a lot of issues in East Jerusalem around settler activity. I won't go deep into that, but just to mention that this law is asymmetric. If you're a Palestinian and left a property in West Jerusalem, you cannot return your rights and return your properties today.
All right. What role did Dov Yosef play in Jerusalem?
Dov Yosef was, during the war, the military governor of the city, and he was de facto the mayor of the city during the war. He managed to pull the city through a period in which the Palestinians encircled the city and didn't let any assistance, food, even water to enter the city. The Jewish city was actually starving during April 1948, but he rationed, he was very strict, he gave everyone rations, you had those seats, etc. He wasn't very popular because of it. And so that was mostly his role. Later on, he became a minister in the government, so had less of a position.
Okay. Abu Dis and Al-Azariah were part of Jerusalem under Jordanian rule. Why did the generals remove them from the city after 1967?
I'm not really sure about that. I think there were kind of localities of villages to the east of Jerusalem, but de facto, until the 90s, until the Oslo Accords, they were part of the metropolitan of East Jerusalem. So people were living there, commuting every day. There weren't any difference because there was no borders. But since the Oslo Accord, we have checkpoints along the municipal border, and especially after the construction of the separation wall, we discuss this next session, they were de facto left behind, beyond the wall.
Okay. We will take a few more questions, and I want to apologize. We won't be able to answer all the questions, and maybe some of them will also be answered next week. Now, a question regarding transport infrastructure in Jerusalem. How is it in relationship to the rest of Israel? When were they build large highways or public transportation systems set up?
So Jerusalem is very hilly, so it's a bit more difficult to build large, I would say, roads, but especially during the 90s, some of the major, I would say, autostradot, right, the highways within like Begin were built, or road number 1. But I guess the major development is in 2010, the construction of the first light rail in Israel, in Jerusalem. Now they built a similar one in Tel Aviv. Until now we have only one line, but they are constructing other lines. And also the connection to the fast train to Tel Aviv, just 5 or 6 years ago, that's a major transition. I don't know. What is also, maybe I would mention that East and West Jerusalem has a different set of transportation systems. They try to unite them, but in West Jerusalem or in the Jewish neighborhoods, you have the Israeli companies, and in Israel, in East Jerusalem, you still have the remains of old local Jordanian small companies.
Okay, thank you very much, Marik. And I would like to say that this series was actually planned for October, and October surprised us all. And not that everything is okay today, but we postponed the series from October, and happy Marik could join us now. And talking about Jerusalem is always relevant. And we hope to continue with you all next week and waiting for better news. Thank you very much.